The time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On Monday, the Prime Minister was asked if power prices were higher or lower since this government came to office and refused to answer. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister was asked about the average Sydney household paying $1,000 more since this government came to power and refused to answer. So, Prime Minister, just answer. How much have power bills increased since the Liberals came to office?
The Leader of the House and the Minister for the Environment and Energy will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm glad to get a question on energy prices from the Leader of the Opposition. Mr Speaker, the one thing we do know is that they doubled under the previous Labor government. The one thing we do know is that they have increased substantially in very recent times because of the increase in the price of gas. And we know that that was because of a shortage in gas on the East Coast, because of a policy failure by the Labor Party, to which the member for Port Adelaide has, albeit belatedly, confessed. He has. Absolution will be delayed, however. He shouldn't hold his breath for that. He needs a bit more penance, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, we also know, Mr Speaker, that there has been an increase in the price of electricity in New South Wales in recent times because of the closure of Hazelwood, and because that created a large gap in dispatchable energy.
Member for Hunter and the Minister for Immigration. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. It created a large gap in dispatchable energy across the electricity market. That resulted in a $50 a megawatt-hour increase alone, in excess of, in New South Wales alone. Now, what we're doing is ensuring that everything we can do brings those prices down. So, this is what we've done. Firstly, we've gone to the retailers and said you've got to get in touch with your customers and tell them if they're on the wrong plan. And you know,
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, the question is how much have they gone up?
Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. As he knows from my previous rulings, Leader of the House will cease interjecting. As he knows from my previous rulings, I give even extra latitude when the preamble is about 90% of the question. The Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have taken steps to ensure that those people get a discount, and we know that many have. Indeed, many journalists have. They've written about it with pleasure and approval in their columns recently. Hundreds of dollars, Mr Speaker. Hundreds of dollars. No compassion. No compassion for the press gallery on that side of the House. No compassion for their household bills. What a hunt. No compassion for the blackout bills they'll have to pay for if they don't get action on energy prices. We're bringing down gas prices already. In terms of dispatchable energy, we're taking practical steps with AGL on Liddell. One obvious option to avoid it creating a big gap is to keep that power station running for longer. So we're exploring that with the company. And in the longer term, we're building the biggest renewable power system in the country's history since Snowy 1, which Snowy Hydro 2, which will make renewables reliable, is derided by the Labor Party as a stunt. They have no policies and no plan. The only thing we know Australians will have to pay for is the blackout bill.
The member for, just before I call the member for Chisholm, the member for Kingston has already been ejected this week for persistent interjecting is warned, as is the member for Barker. The member for Chisholm has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on actions the government has taken to reduce the cost of electricity and gas for households and businesses?
The member for Chisholm will resume her seat. The member for Sydney is warned. And the member for Chisholm can begin her question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on actions the government has taken to reduce the cost of electricity and gas for households and businesses, including in my electorate of Chisholm?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, our focus is on ensuring Australians have affordable and reliable power, that the lights come on and stay on and that they can afford to keep them on. And we know what happens when Labor governments fail to plan their electricity system properly. We know what happens in South Australia. The great confessor himself, the member for Port Adelaide, knows all about that. His state, thanks to absurd and ideological and idiotic Labor policies, have resulted in that state having the least reliable and the most expensive electricity in Australia. Now, Mr Speaker, we can't do what the opposition leader has said about the challenges we currently face and treat them as an issue down the track. No. That's what he said. That's what he said. So we did the right thing. We went to the energy market operator and we said, tell us what is going to happen to baseload power in the years ahead, in the immediate term, this summer, for example, in the future term. A very important question. And we were advised that the closure of ADELAIDE in 2022 would result in a big gap in dispatchable power, which would inevitably provide a similar shock to the closure of Hazelwood, unless something was put in its place, and there was no evidence of anything being put in its place. So, what did we do? We went to Liddell, to AGL, and we said, can you keep it going for longer? Can you consider selling it? They've said yes, they'll put that to their board. We thank them for that. They reckon they've got some other ideas. We'll look at them too. But, Mr Speaker, what we're doing is we're addressing long-term problems today. Now, Mr Speaker, I mentioned earlier the work that we're doing to ensure that we have the backup. Now, you know, the storage that we need is vitally important. And I'll give honourable members an insight into how uninformed the Labor Party was. When they published the modelling for their CPRS in 2012, all that they said about storage was this. In fact, they said nothing about it. They said
Member for Isaacs.
As intermittent generators such as wind produce less generation per unit of capacity on average than other generators, it will require the installation of a greater amount of total generation capacity, particularly additional gas. Well, of course, thanks to them, the gas was unaffordable. Labor never gave a thought to the fundamental challenges that face our market. We need to ensure we have affordable and reliable power, meet our international obligations, and to do that you have to have a plan.
The Prime
we do, and Labor doesn't.
Has concluded. Members on both sides, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister, and I just ask again. Prime Minister, how much have power bills for Australians gone up since the Liberals formed government in 2013?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Mr Speaker, of course we have seen increases in power prices recently. Of course we have. They came down significantly when the coalition came into government and the carbon tax was abolished. They came down significantly, and we have seen them going up again recently. And the reason they've been going up is because of the impact of decisions taken by the Labor Party. The Labor Party, Mr Speaker, they can wave their arms around and shout as much as they like, but it was the Labor Party. It was the Labor Party that allowed gas to be exported without any protection for the domestic market. None. They did not give any thought to the protection of the Australian market. They did nothing to ensure that gas would be developed in onshore
Prime Minister
Victoria.
will resume his seat. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The one thing I'll disagree with the Prime Minister on, they can't shout as much as they want, and anyone that continues to do so will be leaving under 94A. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. I think I know which one.
That's right, Speaker. Direct relevance. This question
the
is,
Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I'm ready to rule on the matter. The Prime Minister, whilst it was a short, tight question, has addressed the substance of it very early on and is entitled to remain on the policy topic. The Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stop shouting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the important focus for all of us here should be ensuring that Australians' electricity prices are lower and that electricity is reliable. Not just today and tomorrow, and I've described the steps we're taking to ensure that, but in the years ahead, in the years and indeed decades ahead. And that requires careful planning. Now, the Leader of the Opposition groans when you talk about careful planning. Well, he might. He is a complete stranger to it, Mr. Speaker. He has never thought more than a moment ahead in time. All tactics, no strategy. Typical about what he said about Liddell. When he talked about when Liddell closure, the implications of that was made plain, he said that's an issue down the track. Well, that's what happened with Hazelwood. They closed on 5 months' notice, or a bit less, and we saw a massive gap in dispatchable power. Now, had there been proper planning in place for that, which should have started years before, many, many years before, then that gap in dispatchability could have been taken up by something else. Perhaps it could have continued for a few more years, but the reality was the market fell off a cliff, and it's households and businesses that are paying the price. The same lack of planning was seen over gas, when the member for Port Adelaide first said we weren't warned, then he had to admit that he had been warned, he had to fess up, but the reality is, of course they were warned, and they ignored it. Why? Exactly. Because it was another issue down the track. Yeah. That's the problem with Labor. No plan, no competence, all ideology, all idiocy. Yeah.
Just before I call the member for Bonner, I'd like to advise the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon a very prominent Australian, Olivia Newton-John, accompanied by her husband John. And her team from the Olivia Newton-John Institute. On behalf of all members, a warm welcome, and I'll also point out she's also a very prominent Carlton supporter. The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer.
Member for Bonner has the call.
Will the Treasurer outline to the House why it is important to take an all-of-the-above approach on sources of energy to put downward pressure on energy prices? Why is this important for jobs in my electorate, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. A key part of the Prime Minister's plan to put downward pressure on raising electricity prices is to have a durable investment framework that will encourage investment in new sources of energy supply, but ensure that we have baseload energy supply to support the growth of our economy, to ensure that businesses don't shut down, as they had to in South Australia because of the failed energy policies and experiments that are the policy of the Federal Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. That's the way that Australians can get more hours when their businesses stay open. That's the way Australians can get jobs, is when the businesses they work for can stay open. And our policies, designed to put downward pressure on electricity prices, are designed to do that. And it's very important that when you land on an investment framework, that you ensure that you embrace all of the potential energy sources available to you, that you have an all-of-the-above approach, that you ensure that you're taking advantage of the traditional advantages that we have as a country with our traditional sources such as coal, but also to ensure that we're taking advantage of the renewable energy resources as well. Now, the Labor Party is standing in the way of us achieving that type of durable investment framework because they are imposing a coal veto on Australia, Mr. Speaker. They are putting a coal veto a coal veto on an investment framework that can secure baseload energy support for Australia. And they announced it before the last election.
Member for
In their
Hunter.
policy that was released in April before the last election, they said they would introduce a framework to kick-start the closure of Australia's coal-fired power plants. That was the plan. That was the design. That was the intention. The member for Shortland, the member for Hunter, the member for Patterson, the whole crew, Mr Speaker, signed up to a plan to shut down coal-fired power stations in this country. In fact, they went further. They said they would retire them, Mr Speaker. They would retire Australia's existing coal-fired generation. And they had the policies to back that up, because they had a 45% emissions reduction policy, which is twice what the government says, Mr Speaker, twice that, and the cost to jobs and the cost to wages and the cost to the economy that would follow from that, they would be responsible for, Mr Speaker. On top of that, they have a 50% renewable energy target that the Shadow Treasurer can't even explain, let alone own up to, Mr Speaker, when asked about it. But, Mr Sir, no one who works in the coal industry should be any doubt, or working in traditional power generation, that this Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party is not on their side. They're not on their side, Mr Speaker. On this side of the House, they can count on us, because as we've seen at Whyalla, as we've seen in Portland, this government, the Turnbull government, stands up for jobs in those industries, while those opposite have a policy to shut them down, cheering on the closure of Hazelwood, cheering on AGL as they close down Liddell, Mr Speaker.
The member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Before coming to office, the Liberal Party promised families that they would be $550 a year better off because of lower power prices. This government is now in its 5th year in office. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the average Sydney household is paying almost $1,000 more on power bills this year than when the federal Liberal government was elected in 2013?
The Minister for the Environment.
Well, I can tell the honourable member she's just made that number up, Mr Speaker, because where is your evidence? There is absolutely no evidence for that. But what I can tell you is the evidence from the ACCC's report from 2015, which said, and I quote, the Commonwealth's Treasury's estimated $550 cost saving to households is reasonable. And that is what came from the abolition of the carbon tax, Mr Speaker. Now, under the Labor Party, electricity prices increased by more than 100%. That was the record of the Labor Party. Indeed, in your own election platform that you went to the last election, you said, and I quote, from 2007 to 2013, average retail electricity prices in Australia soared, Mr Speaker. That's the Labor Party's own election platform. That is what you acknowledge happened on your watch. Now, on the Prime Minister's watch, what we have seen is an attempt across a whole range of areas to put downward pressure on prices, Mr Speaker. The gas price, the spot price for gas has come down significantly from the beginning of this year, Mr Speaker, and every dollar a gigajoule that it comes down is worth $10 a megawatt hour to households, Mr Speaker, in reduced prices. When it comes to the networks, Mr Speaker, under the Labor Party, the rate of return for those investments was around 10%, Mr Speaker. Today it is just above 6%, Mr Speaker. That leaves Australian consumers about $300 a year better off, Mr Speaker. And in the state of Queensland, it was government-owned generators that were gaming the system and saw Queensland have the highest wholesale electricity prices in the national electricity market for the first 5 months of this year, Mr Speaker. And under pressure from the Commonwealth Government, the Queensland Labor government had to give a direction to those operators to put more supply into the market and to no longer game the system. This can be worth up to $100 a year, Mr Speaker, to Queensland households. So right across the board we're taking action. not to mention for retail customers, Mr Speaker. The actions by the Turnbull government can see Australian households save more than $1,000 a year by moving retailers or by changing contracts. And we know that 50% of households have not changed retailers or contracts in the last 5 years, even though there are these enormous savings to be found. So whether it's the work we're doing with the networks, the work we're doing with the retailers, the work we're doing with the gas, we are driving electricity prices down, whereas Labor's record was only higher prices, where it more than doubled on the Leader of the Opposition's watch.
The member for Port Adelaide. I think actually, no, sorry, member for Port Adelaide. No, member for Port Adelaide will resume his seat. He hasn't asked the question, so he's not in a position to table anything. It's the independence question, but just before I call the member for Mayo, I'd also like to advise the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon a delegation from the Northern Territory, led by the Chief Minister, the Honourable Michael Gunner, and also told he's joined by the Treasurer, Nicole Morrison. On behalf of the House, a warm welcome to you and your delegation. And I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In a letter enclosing the interim investigation into New South Wales water management, Ken Matthews stated, "Compliance and enforcement arrangements in New South Wales have been ineffectual and require significant and urgent improvement." He stated that individual cases of alleged non-compliance have remained unresolved for far too long and that a systemic fix is required. Given Ken Matthews' findings and water theft allegations in at least 2 states, do you now agree we need an urgent judicial inquiry into the implementation of the $13 billion Murray-Darling Basin Plan?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and note that the Ken Matthews inquiry which she refers to, which has been diligently carried out, was actually instigated by the Coalition in New South Wales, instigated by Niall Blair. And what we had in that inquiry was 3 ICAC qualified investigators, people that had experience in ICAC, and the information that they have brought forward is now available if further prosecutions need to occur. That goes on the back of Hanlon himself referring himself to ICAC, and I note there's been discussions that he has questions certainly to answer there. On top of that, of course, we have the independent inquiry by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which is currently underway, and we also have an auditor's inquiry as well as a Senate inquiry. Now, ICAC is well and truly capable of sending people to jail, as we've seen with a couple of members who were formerly in the New South Wales Labor Party, now residing at Her Majesty's pleasure
on both sides.
In respective institutions around town. We never ever condone water theft. We don't condone any form of theft, and we certainly don't condone water theft. And in pursuit of this, we will be making sure that if any of these allegations stacked up, that they will be pursued to the full extent of the law. What I can say also, and it must be important, that at this point they remain allegations. They remain allegations, and I am also aware of other issues that have been brought forward in regards to defamation cases, so we have to be very careful that we differentiate between allegations and proof.
The member for Banks.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking to ensure that Australian families and businesses have a reliable and affordable energy supply? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Banks for his question, and I know that he's deeply concerned about the pressure that households and businesses are faced by a less stable and higher-priced electricity system, and he is working to do everything possible to bring downward pressure on prices. And that's why he supports the actions that we've taken on this side of the House, whether it's to ensure more gas is available to the domestic market, whether it's reining in the powers of the poles and the wire companies with the abolition of limited merits review, which Labor sees fit to send to committee, Mr Speaker, or the actions and the concessions that we have received from the retailers, which will allow Australian families and businesses to get a better deal, Mr Speaker. But I'm asked, are there any alternative views? Now, we know that the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Port Adelaide have bumbled, have fumbled, have stumbled on the key question on what would they do with existing coal-fired power stations, Mr Speaker. Because we know on that side of the House they have a policy to close Australia's coal-fired power stations, Mr Speaker. We know that they have sold out blue-collar workers in order to win Green votes in the city, Mr Speaker. And we know when the member for Port Adelaide was asked numerous times what would he do, keep them open or close them, he dodged, he weaved, he wouldn't answer, Mr Speaker. But the piece de resistance was when the member for Port Adelaide went on late line, Mr Speaker, because when he was asked by Emma Alberici what would Labor do with the coal-fired power stations in Australia, were you in the same position of the Turnbull government? Well, he said, we would put all the options on the table, Mr Speaker. I thought this is a rare show of bipartisanship, Mr Speaker. But then Emma Alberici asked the next question. Can you just give me a yes or a no? Member for Port Adelaide, no, Mr Speaker. Emma Alberici then asked him a very simple question. Why not, Mr Speaker? This is what the member for Port Adelaide said. No, I can't give you a yes or a no, Mr Speaker. No, I can't give you a yes or a no, Mr Speaker. That's because the member for Port Adelaide, he wants a multiple choice question, Mr Speaker. He wants a multiple choice question. He wants to say one thing to the blue-collar workers. He wants to say another thing to the Green voters whose support he wants, and he wants to say a third thing to the press gallery, Mr Speaker. He can't give a simple yes or no answer on whether they would support existing coal-fired power stations. That's because the Labor Party is the party of higher electricity prices.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Since this government came to office, power bills have gone up by $1,000 for the average Sydney household. That figure is based on data from the government's own Australian Energy Regulator and the Australian Energy Market Commission reported in the Australian newspaper. Why is the Prime Minister refusing to admit that power prices have never been higher than they have been under this government? Everyone else knows it. Why won't the Prime Minister admit it?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member for Port Adelaide is making up more numbers, Mr Speaker, because we know that power prices increased by 100% under him, and the member for Port Adelaide should know better. You know why? Because Adelaide Brighton, in his own electorate, which has 450 workers, lost power for 36 hours when South Australia had a blackout, Mr Speaker. And we know that in his own electorate, Adelaide Brighton, the company's own electorate that employs hundreds of people, had to book a $13 million penalty or price because of that blackout, Mr Speaker. That is the price of Labor's reckless policies. Now, it takes some kind of genius that the member for Port Adelaide must be to describe the energy policy in South Australia as a hiccup, Mr Speaker. He described it as a hiccup. This is a policy which has led to more than $500 million in expenses in South Australia when they had a statewide blackout, Mr Speaker. This is a policy that led the Premier of Jay Weatherall to spend $110 million on diesel generators that use 80,000 litres an hour and that, when they're supposed to be used in peak summer months, don't work when the temperature's hot, Mr Speaker. That is the Labor policy. It takes some genius in South Australia to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a new gas-fired power station, Mr Speaker. And the Prime Minister might be interested to know that when the Northern Power Station was open in South Australia only got 12% of its energy from Victoria through the Hayward Interconnector, Mr Speaker. 12% in the years 14-15 of brown coal-fired power from Victoria. But in the years 16 to 17, after the closure of the Northern Power Station, how much brown coal did you get from Victoria and South Australia? 20%, Mr Speaker. 20%. So the Labor Party's policy of following down Jay Weatherall in South Australia, who gave them diesel generators that don't work when the sun is out, Mr Speaker, diesel generators that use 80,000 litres an hour, gas-fired power stations that have to be built by the government, more coal-fired power from Victoria than when the Northern Power Station was in operation. That is what the green policies of the Labor Party look like, Mr Speaker. And the member for Port Adelaide should know much better, because in his own electorate, where hundreds of workers are employed, they have had a blackout which has cost their own company money. The member for Port Adelaide should look in his own backyard before asking questions in this place about the prices of power, Mr Speaker.
The member for Port Adelaide seeking leave to table the document.
I am, Mr Speaker, seeking leave to table copies of the data reported in the Australian newspaper that the minister says don't exist.
Is the article from the Australian newspaper?
It is.
Okay. Well, I've made clear on numerous occasions we're not going to. Yeah. Yes, the manager of opposition business.
Speaker, point of order.
Yes. Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The point of
Leader
order.
Of the House is warned.
The ruling that you've made previously about articles not being able to be tabled is on the basis that it's accepted they're in the public domain. The minister has just advised the House he doesn't believe it exists. In those circumstances, it's the exact time where it should be allowed to be tabled.
Resume his seat. I think you're quibbling, but I'll just be quick. Is leave granted? Leave's not granted. Right. Let's move on to the next question. The member for Calare.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Agriculture, Water Resources and Northern Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the importance to agricultural industries, including those based in my electorate of Calare, of affordable and reliable energy supply? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to jobs and energy security in my home state of New South Wales?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note the wine industry, which is doing spectacular work in the seat of Calare. And it's great to see the wine industry going from $2.2 billion to $3.5 by 2020, a remarkable turnaround in prices, and it has happened under this government. It's one of the sections of remarkable turnarounds in the record-producing agricultural sector, record to our GDP. But in all these things, the wine industry, the beef industry, the sheep industry, the irrigation industry, there is a major threat, and of course that is the price of power. The price of power, because if you can't lift the water for irrigation, then it doesn't matter what's going down the river, you can't actually irrigate, and it doesn't matter what margin you make on the wine industry if it's gobbled up by power prices. And most importantly, and the member for Clare would be well aware of this, it's those people who live in the weatherboard in Iron and Orange and in Bathurst, how we actually respect the dignity of their lives by keeping affordable, reliable power so that they can maintain the dignity in their lives and maintain their standard of living. Now, we have seen the threat to it. No better expose would be than South Australian Labor. South Australian Labor, when they knocked over the Northern Power Plant, in fact, they blew up the chimney to celebrate it. What we see, the complete fiasco in power prices in South Australia. The lights went out, the lifts stopped, the traffic blocked up. People felt insecure because of Labor Party power policy. And then if it's not enough, then they went to Victoria, and the Labor Party in Victoria, what do we see? The close down in Hazelwood. What was the effect? It put under pressure manufacturing workers' jobs. It put under pressure, it lost power workers' jobs. What else did it do? Well, of course, it put up the price of power so every person, no matter where they were, whether they were in Wodonga, whether they were in Mildura, or whether they were in Shepparton, their lives were made worse by the Labor Party in Victoria because they lost money and they were put under pressure. And now federal Labor do not stand by Liddell. And we can see this because they're all going for that great title that they now have in the Labor Party. They used to sing Solidarity Forever, but now they look for the edict from wanting to be basket weaver number one, and they're all fighting for that title to be basket weaver number one. And I think the member for Hunter did a good job last night. Last night he said, and I quote, Andy Vesey and AGL did us all a big favour. They did what no one else has ever done before. Well, you're right there. They're doing what no one else has ever done before. which has put the member for Hunter's workers out of a job, put more pressure on manufacturing workers, put more pressure on coal miners. They don't believe in blue-collar workers anymore. And then we see the Labor Party policy. Labor, this is from from Mark Butler, another wind chime tune number 2.
Deputy Prime Minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
Well, Labor will introduce a framework to kickstart the closure of coal-fired power stations. You can't get any better than that. That is the Labor Party.
Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Just over 3 months ago, the Prime Minister described the clean energy target this way, and I quote, "Well, it would certainly work. There is no question it would work. And it has a number of virtues, very strong virtues. And again, it has a lot of merit. And as I say, we will look at it very favourably." Prime Minister, will there be a clean energy target, yes or no?
The members on my left and right, the Minister for Social Services, the Treasurer. I remind the member for Hunter he's already been warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
All right. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as I made very clear, we are considering the 50th recommendation of the Finkel Review, which is about a clean energy target. Now, what we need to achieve in our policy is to ensure that energy remains affordable, becomes more affordable, in fact, that it becomes more reliable, and that we meet our emissions reduction obligations. We have seen that there is a major problem in ensuring reliability. We've seen a big loss in dispatchable power following the closure of Hazelwood, and have foreshadowed another big loss from the closure of Liddell, were it to go ahead in 2022. The renewable energy target, for example, and the clean energy target is a evolution of a renewable energy target. Well, it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They are able to shout and carry on as much as they like, but it is the facts that make them uncomfortable. But the fact is, a clean energy target is an evolution of a refinement, if you like, of a renewable energy target. What the renewable energy target did not do, has not done, is provide support for the storage and the backup that is required to make renewables reliable. Now, I know, Mr Speaker, this is not taken seriously by the Labor Party. No. Well, the problem is, however, blackouts and unaffordable power bills are taken seriously by Australians. And they know that they're the ones that have to pay for the blackout bill. They're the ones that have to pay for the— well, they do. They do have to pay.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. The member for Rankin. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, on Monday you made rulings about people as being referred to about their titles. The revisiting of that term, I've got to say, is too cute by half, and if we're going to descend the place into name-calling, it's not going to reflect well on anyone in the chamber, including those who engage in it.
I'm very happy to address the chamber if people cease interjecting. As the Manager of Opposition Business points out, my ruling on Monday, I hope he appreciates, was where I asked the Prime Minister to withdraw, and indeed I sat down the Minister for the Environment and Energy for not referring to members by their correct titles. The Prime Minister was not doing that on that occasion. As you know, he was not. I am not in a position as Speaker to rule out language when there is not a breach of the standing order with respect to addressing members by their correct titles. I do make the point, though, that I can only operate within the rules that are here, and it does cut both ways. I make that point. The member for Grainler might just be uncharacteristically quiet for a bit, I think, and we'll move on to the next question. The member for GROOM.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the Minister outline to the House why it is important for employer and employee organisations to act in a way that promotes truthfulness, integrity and manages the potential for conflict of interest. Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. The member for McMahon is warned.
Here. Sorry,
I haven't ejected anyone under 94A yet, but I sense I'm getting very close. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for GROOM for his question. I hear the members of the Labor Party catcalling about the head of the ABCC, but I didn't hear them saying that John Setka should be resigned or should be sacked for the terrible things that John Setka did, or any of the other. So they stand up for John Setka while they criticise Nigel Hotchkiss. I mean, doesn't that just sum up the Labor Party of today, Mr Speaker? It absolutely sums up the modern Labor Party. They want John Setka to have a place at the cabinet table, one of the worst people in the union movement, and they criticise former public servants. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Groom asked me about the importance of managing conflicts of interest. And it occurred to me, the member for Groom, it occurred to me that there's quite a number of these issues that the Leader of the Opposition is yet to answer, Mr Speaker, and I thought I might outline a few of those conflicts of interest to the House. He's yet to answer, for example, if he declared his conflict of interest when he was the Secretary of the AWU and whether he was on the board of GetUp when he gave $100,000 to the GetUp organisation as a start-up loan, Mr Speaker, in fact a grant. He's yet to say whether he declared his conflict of interest when he was on the board of Australian Super and they donated to the Australian Workers' Union, and that not long after the Australian Workers' Union employed a full-time employee to work on the Maribyrnong campaign when he was the candidate there for the Labor Party. Well, there's only two so far, Mr Speaker, and more recently, of course, we've been asking in this House for him to explain why IUS Holdings paid $560,000 to the AWU at the same time as his union was negotiating 28 EBAs with businesses where IUS Holdings was the income protection, the required income protection business. And he still hasn't answered why Incolink gave $405,000 to the AWU when his union was negotiating 48 enterprise business bargaining agreements with businesses where, again, Incolink was the required workers' entitlement fund, Mr Speaker. So there are at least 4 or 5 significant conflicts of interest or unexplained payments that the Leader of the Opposition thinks he can keep avoiding. Now, Mr Speaker, all these Deirdre Chambers moments that we've experienced with the Leader of the Opposition, all these amazing coincidences that remind us of Muriel's wedding and Bill Heslop and Deirdre Chambers, the thing in Muriel's wedding is that, of course, it ended up catching up with Deirdre and Bill. It caught up with Deirdre and Bill, Mr Speaker. Eventually Deirdre and Bill were undone by all these coincidences, and you can only be this shifty for so long, Mr Speaker, before the public work you out. You can't get away with being this shifty for this long.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In June, the Prime Minister said the clean energy target, and I quote, "Well, it would certainly work. There is no question it would work." But a government MP has said in today's Sydney Morning Herald, and I quote, "If we were going to do Finkel's clean energy target, it would be done already." Is the Prime Minister so weak that he's letting a few backbenchers stand in the way of a clean energy target, a policy he said there is no question would work?
Members on both sides. The Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the feebleness of the opposition is shown in this sort of question. I tell you, Mr Speaker, there is no place for complacency or neglect in energy policy. The Labor Party has proved that comprehensively. One mistake after another, and we're still living with the consequences. I referred a moment ago to the detailed Treasury analysis of the CPRS in 2012. No thought to the problem of storage. The reality is, Mr Speaker, energy policy in Australia has been labouring under a huge misapprehension. There has been a failure to consider storage and the need for backup. Now, Mr Speaker, if you want to have a lot of renewables, the member for Sydney says build some. No, that's what your leader called the helicopter stunt. That's Snowy Hydro 2.0. Give me a break. We're building the biggest renewable energy project since Snowy Hydro 1. Now, the fact of the matter is this. A clean energy target for its operation depends entirely on its design. But if it is to be effective in delivering not just a reduction in emissions, but affordability and reliability, it has to have built into it measures which support dispatchability, which support baseload power, which support affordability and reliability. It's not an easy nut to crack. We've only recently had detailed advice from AEMO, which shocked many people, particularly on the Labor side. So we're working through with it. We're going through it very, very carefully. We are not going to make the same glib mistakes the Labor Party did, the price of which is being paid by Australian families and businesses today.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on steps the government is taking to strengthen Australian citizenship? Why is it important that aspiring Australians are of good character, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and for the great work he does in Western Australia. Mr Speaker, over the course of the last couple of years, this government has cancelled the visas now of about 2,800 non-citizens, people who have been here on visas on a temporary basis and who have committed offences, very serious offences against Australian citizens. We've ramped up by about 1,200% the number of those visa cancellations, and we've made Australia a safer place as a result of that action. Now, the reality is, Mr Speaker, that under the Labor Party, many of those people would have gone on to become Australian citizens, and that is an unacceptable outcome. People who come here, the 99% of people who come to our country, do the right thing, they abide by the Australian laws, but the one thing that this government will deliver to the Australian people is that we will deliver the best possible national security environment. We will keep our borders secure, and we will make sure that the Labor Party does not get in its way. Now, we've introduced a bill into the parliament which has passed the lower house and is now in the Senate in relation to tightening up in relation to citizenship, so that we can make sure that people who have abided by Australian laws, who have adhered to our values and have integrated into the Australian society can become Australian citizens, and those that haven't do not become Australian citizens. Now, the reality is, Mr Speaker, that when you are looking at a Labor leader, you know that he or she is most weak when he sides or she sides with the Greens. We saw it in Julia Gillard, we saw it in Kevin Rudd, and we see it with this leader as well. And the fact is, Mr Speaker, that in the Senate at the moment, the Greens have moved a motion to wipe off this citizenship bill from the notice paper, and it has only been supported, you wouldn't believe it, Mr Speaker, not by Nick Xenophon, not by Corey Bernardi, not by Pauline Hanson, not by anybody else except for the Labor Party. The Labor Party, Mr Speaker, don't want this debate because they are torn internally in relation to it. And you see what happens when the Labor Party cuddles up beside the Greens. You know that they're in this battle in seats in inner cities around the country where they're desperate. They're desperate to stave off the attacks from the Greens. And what does it result in? Well, in relation to boats, Mr Speaker, when the Labor Party cuddled up next to the Greens, 50,000 people came on 800 boats and 1,200 people drowned at sea. And you know what else, Mr Speaker? We know that when the Labor Party cuddled up beside the Greens and they were in coalition with the Greens, you know what happens when that happens in relation to energy policy? The fact is that we get blackouts and we get blowouts in electricity prices. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that under the Labor Party, particularly when you've got a weak, shifty leader like this Leader of the Opposition, you will know that boats will always come under that Labor Party, and you know that energy prices will always be higher under that leadership.
The member for McEwen is warned. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister used to say, and I quote, "I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am." Has the Prime Minister forgotten that when Labor was in government, not only did he support the policies he just ridiculed, he crossed the floor to vote for them? Prime Minister.
Members
Prime
on
Minister,
my left.
what happened to the member for Wentworth people used to know?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I haven't called the Prime Minister yet. The Leader of the House, members on my left, members on my left, members on my left. Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. The members for Wakefield and Bruce will leave under 94A. The member for Wakefield is about to be named. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the point that we have to recognise is that energy policy has failed Australians over a very long time. It is a fact. It is a fact that we have to address and we have to redress. Now, the difference between our side of the House and Labor's is that we recognise that failure and we're getting on with sorting out the problems we inherited. We are getting on and dealing with it. We are ensuring that Australians are getting discounts on their energy bills right now. We're ensuring that wholesale gas prices are coming down right now. We're ensuring that we're planning for the future of an energy market that will deliver the emissions reductions we need, that will deliver the clean energy Australians expect, but will also deliver affordable and reliable power. Now, the Labor Party can assume, if they like, as has been done in the past, that you can bring more variable energy into the grid and do nothing about backup or storage. Well, if you want to continue doing that, you'll have more blackouts and more blackout bills to pay for. Now, we believe, Mr Speaker, that energy policy must be guided by engineering and economics, and that's what we're doing, ensuring that we have all the measures in place to protect Australians. Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker,
Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, the member for Watson there is shouting his head off. What a pathetic display. Go redder. He's getting so red, Mr Speaker. Oh, he's settling down now. He's settling down now. That's good. That's good for his heart. Very important. Don't overdo it. Don't overdo it. Mr Speaker, what we need is affordable and reliable energy, because the reality is, if we don't have it, Australians will pay the blackout bill.
The Manager of Opposition Business. The Manager of Opposition Business will cease interjecting. The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the Minister update the House on the government's commitment to create a simpler, fairer welfare system that helps move people from welfare to work? Are there any challenges to this commitment?
The Minister will just resume his seat somewhere there on the front bench for a second. The level of interjections is ridiculously high. I need to hear the question. I would have thought most members in the chamber want to hear the question, and certainly members in the public gallery want to hear the question. I'll call the Minister in a second. If there's a repeat of those interjections, the member for Cunningham knows better. She's on the Speaker's panel. She can remove herself under 94A. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And as the member is aware, this government has reduced spending growth on unemployment benefits down to 3.7% a year That is down from a whopping average growth of 13.5% each year for 6 years under Labor. And, Mr Speaker, that success in moving Australians from welfare to work has been underpinned by policies like business tax cuts, increasing investment and job growth, by welfare reforms designed to activate more people into job preparation and job search. And, Mr Speaker, the welfare reform bill that passed this House yesterday would have seen an extra $10 million for rehabilitation and treatment in drug test trials. It will see a $100 million investment to activate more people into job preparation and job search. And, of course, I'm asked about alternatives. And it is actually often quite hard to tell what the alternative Labor policy is on a key issue from week to week. The opposition leader once said, and I'll quote him, "We need to encourage employment participation, not greater welfare dependency." And yet this week, Labor voted against a $110 million investment to help move people from welfare into work through increased employment participation. Now, members, in some good news, we have found a way to work out what Labor policy positions will be. And what you do is you apply what public policy analysis will call the Costanza method of policy identification. In the famous Seinfeld episode, the notoriously shifty George Costanza decides that the best way to make decisions is to do the precise opposite of what you think to do first. And when you apply the Costanza method to the Leader of the Opposition, it is uncannily accurate. So, tax cuts to decrease welfare dependency. First, the Leader of the Opposition says, "Friends, corporate tax cut reforms create jobs right up and down the ladder, including people who might now be on welfare." Apply the Costanza method, and he now says those same tax cuts are a crazy plan. NDIS funding. First he said anyone who opposed the 0.5% increase was dumb. Apply the Costanza method, and now the Leader of the Opposition vigorously opposes the very same funding. The marriage plebiscite. First he said, "I'd rather the people of Australia could make their view clear on this than leaving the decision to 150 people. Apply the Costanza method, and now the 150 people are the only people who get their say, and the Australian people get no say." And finally, Mr Speaker, on the cashless welfare card, the Leader of the Opposition had two opposing points of view in the same sentence. He said there are some people who probably will benefit from this scheme, and then said, but also it's a hard measure just to get a headline. Members, the only ever Leader of the Opposition shiftier than George Costanza.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government is now in its 5th year of office. In that time, 7 coal-fired power stations have closed, removing capacity equivalent to nearly 6 million households' power, or more than enough energy to power every home in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. After 7 power station closures, why has the Prime Minister only discovered that energy supply is a problem now?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the member for Port Adelaide has some hide, Mr Speaker. He has some hide, because he comes from a party that supported the following motion in the Parliament, in the Senate, on the 22nd of March this year, Mr Speaker. It said, "Coal is in structural decline and has no long-term future in Australia," Mr Speaker. That is the words of the Labor opposition. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Port Adelaide also said to the Press Club in April of last year, Labor will introduce a framework to kick-start the closure of coal-fired power stations, Mr Speaker. And at numerous other times have made it very clear that Labor is selling out blue-collar workers in order to win Green votes in the city, Mr Speaker. That is what has happened, and as a result, in the state of South Australia, where the Northern Power Station closed, we saw energy prices dramatically increase, and we also saw the people in his own electorate have blackouts and higher electricity prices. And the Labor colleagues in Victoria and the Leader of the Opposition should know better, that it was the Labor Party that described the continued operation of Hazelwood as, quote, Disgraceful, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party has said about the continued operation of Hazelwood. And the Victorian members on this side know all too well that it was the Andrews government that increased coal royalties on those coal-fired generators in the Latrobe Valley by 300%, Mr Speaker. 300%. And we know that Engie, the owner, with Mitsui of Hazelwood, said that this had caused them problems, Mr Speaker. So it was the Labor Party. It was the Labor Party in South Australia, the Labor Party in Victoria that were responsible for the closure of coal-fired power stations. And now it's the Labor Party and the member for Shortland who won't stand up for the workers in his own electorate. And the member for Hunter, happy to box on in front of the press gallery, but he's very sheepish in the parliament, Mr Speaker. Happy to say one thing to the Newcastle Herald, Mr Speaker, and happy to say another thing to the press gallery, Mr Speaker, because it's the members for Shortland, the members for Hunter, the members for Newcastle, the members for Herbert, Mr Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition, who have sold out their blue-collar base, who have walked away from the party of Chifley, have walked away from the party of Hawke and have decided to join the party of Bob Brown, Mr Speaker, and Richard Di Natale, Mr Speaker. It's the Labor-Greens alliance that the blue-collar workers and the families of Australia have to be aware of, because that is a recipe.
Has concluded. The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Human Services. Will the minister update the House on the government's approach to identify welfare recipients with substance abuse issues and support them to pursue treatment and overcome barriers to employment? And are there any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Human Services.
Well, can I thank the member for Ford for his question? And as members would be aware, from early next year, the government will undertake drug testing trials in 3 locations around the country, including in the member for Ford's electorate, and the member's been a very strong advocate of these drug testing trials. And under the trials, an unemployed person who tests positive the first time will have 80% of their payments placed onto a system of cashless welfare, and by doing so they'll obviously have less cash available to purchase drugs. And we know from our cashless welfare card locations that such a system of cashless welfare can actually reduce the drug taking. Indeed, an independent evaluation of our cashless welfare card trials found that half of all drug takers were using fewer drugs as a result of being placed onto a cashless welfare card. They were using drugs less frequently, and they were taking drugs less overall. The evidence also showed that there was consequently a reduction in the harm and the violence which results from drug taking. And our expectation, Mr Speaker, is that in the drug testing trials, by placing a person who tests positive onto a cashless welfare card system, we'll get similar results. People will take fewer drugs and therefore they'll be better able to get into the employment system. Now, are there any alternatives? Well, the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, as you would know, have explicitly opposed the drug testing trials, and in large part because it places a person onto a system of cashless welfare. But interestingly enough, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party did not always have such a position, because when they were last in government, the Labor Party actually introduced a measure which placed people onto a special form of welfare when the Northern Territory Drug and Alcohol Tribunal found that a person was taking drugs.
Interesting.
And what sort of welfare would that tribunal have placed them on with the blessing of the Labor Party? Cashless welfare. And indeed, the member for Jagga, who introduced this legislation, she said at the time that this new measure would assist the referred person to address alcohol and substance misuse issues. She said that cashless welfare has discernible benefits, including less money being spent on drugs. So apparently cashless welfare was
a great response for drug users under the Labor Party, but apparently now it's a dreadful response now. Not only are they hypocritical, but they do a disservice to those people who need our assistance, and the only people that they're planning on assisting is the drug dealers.
The Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition has the call. The member for Brand will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My questions to the Prime Minister. What has been the net reduction of energy capacity in the national energy market since this government came to office in 2013?
Hear, hear.
Your plan was contracted closure. They blew up Northern and they closed down Hazelwood.
Members on both sides. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly point him to the closure of some very large baseload stations, which was actually connived in fact, delivered by state Labor governments. I mean, the two power stations in South Australia are very good examples. The member for Port Adelaide should be very well aware of that. And Hazelwood certainly was very much a key part of the Victorian Labor government strategy. But, Mr. Speaker, the disappointing part of the opposition's approach to this is they will not face up to the failure of their own policies. They will not face up to the fact that they pursued the massive introduction of renewables without the backup to make them reliable. If you want to have an economy that is powered by renewable energy, you need to have something to back it in when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. Members on both sides, the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Direct relevance. It was a serious, specific question.
The Leader of the Opposition resume his seat. The Prime Minister, I am listening to very carefully, as you'd expect. He addressed the substance of that very specific question. He's still on the policy topic. The standing orders make it clear that questions are 30 seconds, answers up to 30 seconds, I should say, and answers are up to 3 minutes. A questioner cannot demand that the minister answering the question simply answer the question and sit down. If he's on the policy topic, he's being directly relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are two statistical matters I want to conclude with. The first is that the opposition leader has claimed in the House that the Australian Energy Regulator has stated that the average price for electricity in Sydney has, since the date of the coalition government being elected 4 years ago, increased by $1,000 per household. That has been his claim. We've noted that. He's not produced any evidence for it, but we've noted it.
Members on my left.
Members on my left. He has produced no evidence for it. He hasn't cited any publication at all. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the changing energy mix, I can refer the honourable member to the AEMO's advice to the government of just a few days ago in September this year, and it says over the past decade 5,199 megawatts of baseload generation has retired and has been replaced by 2,895 megawatts of GPG, 273 megawatts of hydro, 91 megawatts of liquid fuel, 2,965 megawatts of wind, 265 megawatts of large-scale solar, 240 megawatts of coal plant expansion and 160 megawatts of other sources of generation, such as biomass. I'd encourage him to read the rest of the report, and on that note I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime